We're still in the year 1970, and the film of choice is Scars of Dracula, directed by Roy Ward Baker. This is Hammer's fifth Dracula movie with Christopher Lee, and is without a doubt the most violent Dracula film. The film also has sequences which tend to stick a lot closer to Bram Stoker's novel, and the film gives Christopher Lee a lot to do other than just being a side character. And once again, James Bernard returns to compose the score. The film opens on Castle Dracula, almost recreating the opening shot of Dracula Prince of Darkness. We see Dracula's cape and remains on a stone plinth as a really bad looking bat flies over the plinth and drips blood onto it. This brings Dracula back to life, and during his resurrection, I'm pretty certain that the footage shown is exactly the same as Dracula's demise from the previous movie, Taste the Blood of Dracula, just filmed in reverse. There's no build up to Dracula's resurrection, he just appears. I guess that's an okay thing because we don't have to wait to see the always fantastic Christopher Lee on screen. Throughout the opening credits, we see a villager carrying a young woman who has fallen victim to Count Dracula. He brings her to a tavern. There we see a priest and a landlord among others. The landlord is played by Hammer veteran Michael Ripper. He's always a standout actor in these roles. The landlord is furious by this and wants to put an end to Dracula's reign of terror. The priest agrees to go with him and other villagers as they go to the castle in order to burn it to the ground. When the landlord and the others arrive, we see Dracula's assistant Clove, this time played by Patrick Troughton. Clove isn't the same as he was in Prince of Darkness. Here he's a more scruffy, shabby version of the character. Clove opens the door not knowing of their intentions. The sequence where the villagers are burning down the castle is quite a thrilling scene and one of the best in the Hammer Dracula series. The opening of this film doesn't hold back. The villagers have had enough of Dracula's reign of terror and immediately take action. After setting fire to the castle, they return to a church to meet up with their loved ones. When they arrive, all of their loved ones have been killed by the terrible looking bat, and it's a brutal sight. This is the beginning of Dracula's revenge. Next we're introduced to our main characters. Simon, played by Dennis Waterman, Sarah, played by Jenny Hanley, and once again, Paul. No, not you. This time Paul is played by Christopher Matthews. Again, Hammer had this tendency of using the name Paul for their main heroes. I'm not sure why, it was just their thing. This would be the last time that the name Paul was used in the Hammer Dracula series. Paul and Simon are brothers, and Sarah is engaged to be married to Simon. These side characters, once again, for me, don't stand out like the characters in previous Hammer Dracula movies, especially when compared to Dracula, Dracula Prince of Darkness, and Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. When I think of Hammer side characters, Dennis Waterman usually doesn't come to mind. When Christopher Lee or Patrick Troughton isn't on screen, the film becomes a bit of a drag for me. Later, Paul is seen with a woman and she accuses him of rape, and he flees from the authorities and ends up in the worst place possible, Dracula's castle. He is greeted by Tanya, played by Anushka Hempel, as she brings him into the castle. Shortly afterwards, we see Dracula talking with Paul, insisting that he stays at the castle. Here, Christopher Lee is given some lengthy dialogue, more than what he got in the sequels. In this scene, he's a welcoming host, much like he was in the first Hammer Dracula movie. He explains to Paul that before the castle was destroyed, guests were always welcome. This kind of harkens back to Prince of Darkness when the Kents arrived at the castle and the table was laid out for them. After Dracula instructs Clove to send Paul to his room, Tanya is bitten by Dracula, and during the night she pays Paul a visit. After sleeping with Paul, Tanya, now a vampire, intends to bite him, but is interrupted by Dracula. Paul lunges at Dracula, and obviously the Count has the upper hand, and Paul is thrown aside. Dracula then pulls out a dagger and continuously stabs Tanya in the stomach. This brings me onto the level of violence in Scars of Dracula. The film certainly is the most violent in the Christopher Lee Hammer Dracula series. Kevin Thomas of the Los Angeles Times wrote that the film simply revs up one of the most familiar Dracula plots with sex and violence. The film was the first of several Hammer horror films to get an R rating. Other than the first Hammer Dracula film, Scars of Dracula takes elements from Stoker's novel and features them here. One in particular is when the Count is climbing up the walls of his castle. There is also a sequence where Paul attempts to escape from Dracula's castle. This is an obvious reference to Jonathan Harker in Stoker's novel. After Paul's failure to escape the castle, the film focuses on Sarah and Simon trying to find Paul. Eventually, they end up at Dracula's castle, and it's the same thing repeated as before. Dracula greets them, Clove is instructed to prepare a room, and this time, Dracula falls for Sarah. Whilst preparing Simon to stay the night, there's some great dialogue from Clove as he explains to Simon how the villagers destroyed the castle. Once Paul has settled, Dracula goes to Sarah's room and attempts to bite her but sees a cross necklace, and this obviously causes him to retreat. He then calls Clove and demands that he removes the cross, but Clove refuses.
No. The cross! No!
The reason for this is because Clove came across a photograph of Sarah in Paul's possessions and fell in love with her. Eventually, Clove warns Simon of Dracula and tells them that they must leave the castle, so he lets them go. When Dracula finds out about this, he is full of rage. Clove admits to his sin, and Dracula takes a sword, heats it up by the fire, and places it on Clove's back. This is probably the most evil portrayal of Count Dracula in the series, maybe next to the satanic rites of Dracula, where in that movie, Dracula basically wants to wipe out the whole of humanity. After leaving the castle, Simon takes Sarah to a church where she'll be safe, at least for the time being, as he continues to search for his brother. He decides to go back to the castle and demands that Clove tells him what happened to Paul. Simon arms himself in an attempt to destroy Dracula, and of course his attempt fails. Meanwhile, the terrible-looking bat strikes again and attacks and kills the priest who was with Sarah in the church. Sarah flees and ends up back at Dracula's castle. All this film seems to do is go backwards and forwards with its locations, characters and story. Paul flees one location, ends up at Dracula's castle. Simon and Sarah leave a location to look for Paul, end up at Dracula's castle. Simon and Sarah leave Dracula's castle and Sarah goes to a church for safety, while Simon ends up back at Dracula's castle. Sarah flees the church and, say it with me now, ends up back at Dracula's castle. Eventually, Simon does find his brother in Dracula's castle, but Paul has been killed and is now, in a very Texas Chainsaw Massacre style-like way, being hung from a metal spike or hook on the wall. Again, going back to the level of violence in Scars of Dracula, Hammer were really pushing it this time. Soon, Sarah is confronted by Dracula, and the terrible-looking bat returns as Dracula instructs it to remove Sarah's crucifix. The bat eventually does so and flies away, and that's the last we'll ever see of him. Thank God for that. The Count now walks towards Sarah, but Clove calls out to his master holding a dagger, the same one that Dracula used to kill Tanya. He attempts to kill his master, but Dracula throws him off of the castle and down below. Simon then comes to the rescue, and this brings me on to the Count's death. Dracula's death in Scars of Dracula is one of the best in the series. Simon takes a loose metal spike out from the wall of the castle and throws it into Dracula's torso. The Count simply removes it and raises his arm in an attempt to do the same to Simon. But suddenly a bolt of lightning appears and strikes the rod and Dracula. This causes the Count to go up in flames. Sarah and Simon watch as Dracula wails in agony, throwing himself on top of the castle. Eventually, Dracula falls to his death, still lit up in flames. In conclusion, Scars of Dracula certainly isn't the worst in the franchise, but doesn't offer much. We get a fantastic performance by Patrick Troughton and of course Christopher Lee, who does seem to have more to do this time round. He certainly played the character much more evil than he did in Taste the Blood of Dracula, and I would have liked to have seen a more evil depiction of Dracula from Christopher Lee in the sequel, Dracula AD 1972. The side characters again unfortunately don't have me glued to the screen. Thankfully, the characters in the next film are slightly better, one in particular who has been absent for a while, and it's amazing to see him back again. Tune in next week. Even though Scars of Dracula at times would drag, I would say that overall, I think that it's a much better movie than Taste the Blood of Dracula. Not the best, but certainly not the worst.